Today's session is Innovation in Cropping System. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker. The first speaker is here, Yvonne Lawley. She is professor and assistant professor in the Plant Science Department at the University of Manitoba. Her area of research is agronomy and cropping system. Dr. Lawley's research has focused on several crops, including soybeans, corn, and wheat, and a range of management practices from residue management, strip tillage to cover crops. Her research involves both small plot and on-farm field-scale agronomy research. Dr. Lawley enjoys communicating the results of her research to a wide range of audiences, including farmers, agronomists, scientists in a range of disciplines, and especially in the classrooms where she teaches at the University of Manitoba. Please welcome Dr. Lawley.
Good morning, everyone. This feels very low. Can you hear me? Great. Oh, thanks. Well, I'm happy to be here this morning and happy to see you all here this morning. I hope you have a little bit of energy for this last day at Ag Days. This is my first time coming to speak here, and it's something I've really been looking forward to this fall. This morning's session is focused on themes from regenerative agriculture and many of the different practices that we're trying to explore in Manitoba and put together to develop new systems that are going to increase production and make agriculture more resilient here on the prairies. And so my presentation this morning is focused on one of the pieces of this puzzle that you may be thinking about implementing on your farm, or maybe you are already a practitioner using cover crops and are looking for the next thing. And so I hope that my presentation this morning will meet you where you're at on your journey. I've got a few things here for people just starting out with cover crops, as well as some data from my experiments in from this year, where I can show you sort of the latest and greatest ideas that I'm thinking about in the lab. So one thing that I think it's important to talk about in the context of wherever your journey is with your cropping system, if you're headed towards regenerative agriculture, or whether you're tweaking or adapting the system with whatever label you operate under, is that our thinking about cover crops has really changed. And so, I'm a professor and I use fancy words, and in my classroom I call this a paradigm. Our way of thinking about cover crops has changed. Cover crops are now conventional, where it wasn't the case 10 years ago. And it's for a much wider range of audiences. So we have a lot of interest in cover crops right now in Manitoba, but we have sort of a small group of farmers and a few agronomists that are tooled up to talk and work with farmers or innovate with cover crops, and then we have a lot of people watching, interested, maybe not with a lot of experience. So it's an exciting time to be a researcher working in this area. I also think that, the way we think about cover crops is that, they themselves are not the goal, they're not the destination. Using cover crops is not going to be the end point for you, but the cover crops are a means to an end. And I think today's speakers, the group of us, are going to be coming back to this theme of how are you using these tools to achieve some goals, and hopefully they'll all weave together for a great session this morning. So one of the goals that we have with using cover crops is to make use of the fallow periods that we have in our rotation. And this is an interesting word to use because, when I was, several years ago now, when I was a master's student, when I'm reading the literature on cover crops from the prairies, it was really the period where we had fallow in our rotation, where we were last really talking about cover crops in a big way on the prairies. So that was a time where, we were setting land aside in order to conserve moisture and mineralize nitrogen. But the context of agriculture has changed so much since that time. And the periods of fallow that we're interested in intensifying in our rotation are no longer these whole growing seasons, but they are either spatially within the field or temporally in those early season or late season windows where our crops are not growing. And I'll talk about spatial ways to think about reducing or intensifying our cropping systems later on in my presentation. Now, the goal of intensifying this system is really driven by what we can collect from the sun. And so plants are the way that we capture solar energy and funnel it to this whole community of organisms that we are involved in managing in agriculture. And so we are trying to use these plants to funnel resources to this community that we want to involve in our production system. So at this time where we're still adapting cover crops to the prairies and doing a lot of innovation, it's not always clear what a cover crop is and what is a cover crop going to mean in the prairies. So we don't, I know professors like to come and define what something is. This is a cover crop. But I think right now we're at a time where cover crops and what they are in our prairie systems is somewhat gray, and I'm okay with that. But here are some of the themes that I see how we are using cover crops right now. They are definitely plants that are grown for a purpose, so we're not growing them for grain. But we may be using them to improve soil function. We may be using them to manage pests. Then we are growing at a time and a space usually where our cash crops are not growing. Now, this becomes more intricate and complicated as we think about strategies to establish those cover crops in our short growing season areas. And I think the lines between some of the things that Len and Scott are going to be talking about today about intercropping for grain are going to become blurred and overlapped with some of our goals for cover crops. So I think the more we learn about intercropping, the more we're going to learn about how we can plan for a succession to establish cover crops in our short growing season environment. Now, cover crops are used for a range of goals, and we're going to be talking about goals in a minute. Is a cover crop something that you can harvest for grain? Well, if we think about winter cereals, they grow through those fallow periods, right? We grow them in the fall, they're growing in the early spring. Those may be some of our best cover crops. We can also think about annual forages, and some of the people who have been adopting cover crops most rapidly on the prairies are farmers who have livestock and have seen the great benefit to utilizing these plants for annual forage. So it's hard to come up with a strict definition about cover crops, but I think that the fact that it's messy right now is really optimistic for where we are on the prairies and are thinking about this new tool. So because things are a little wide open right now and we're not too sure exactly where cover crops are going, for my research program, one of the goals that I've been working towards is to start asking farmers about how they're using cover crops, because we don't even really have statistics right now on how many farmers are growing cover crops or what the acreage is of cover crops right now. So this fall, I launched a cover crop survey, and I'm doing my best to try and find some of those answers on who is growing cover crops right now. And today I'm excited to share with you not the completed results, but the preliminary results from the survey data that I've been able to collect so far. If you are someone who's growing cover crops and has not yet added your voice to this survey, I encourage you all to please to take 5 minutes and to reach out to me either on Twitter or by email to take this short online survey so that we can help build this this knowledge that we have about how we're using cover crops right now on the prairies. So this survey, one of the most interesting findings is just knowing, how many farmers are growing cover crops right now. And the survey is across all 3 prairie provinces, and the survey began in late November, and we've had 80 farmers respond, and that has been really exciting to see that there are so many people who have been willing to take the time to do this survey and that are growing cover crops. I don't think that this, as a scientist, you're always doing research to try and come up with a system that approximates real life. I don't think that this is the total number of farmers growing cover crops, but this is the best measure that we have right now. And so I have the word preliminary because the survey is still ongoing for this fall, and these are the best numbers that we have right now about who's growing what. So you can see that the number of farmers that responded in Manitoba is the highest, and that may be because we have more farmers using cover crops in Manitoba, or that might just be because that's where my network as a researcher is the strongest. So I am looking for those who are connected in Saskatchewan and Alberta to help get the word out about this survey. But you can, in the survey, I asked farmers to try and distinguish what periods they're growing cover crops for. So the shoulder season period is either the early spring or the late fall, and the full season cover crop is one that's growing through the majority of the growing season. So you can see in terms of number of farms, the number of acres, we have a lot more shoulder season cover crops, but we have a substantial number of full season cover crops growing as well. So of the people that responded to the survey, I asked them to describe what kind of farmers they were, and these are some of the descriptors that they used to describe their farms. And I think that this group of farmers are the farmers who are probably sitting in this room today who are interested in regenerative agriculture. Some of them labeled themselves that they're trying to practice regenerative agriculture. Most are growing both annual and perennial crops. Many have livestock, but not all of them have livestock. Many of them, but not all of them, are no-till. We also have a significant group of organic farmers, of course, that are growing cover crops as green manures. And we also have, some specialty crop growers as well that are using cover crops. So wherever, you may fit on this list, we asked also, why are farmers growing cover crops? And almost all but 2 of the respondents said that they are using these as a tool to improve soil health. They want to keep living plants growing. They're trying to address erosion. Interestingly, nitrogen fixation and adding nitrogen into their system wasn't something that everyone was looking for. A lot of people are trying to use cover crops to manage problem soils or as a source for grazing. So you, like these farmers, may have your own goals, and this is where I'm going to transition from some of the survey results. We'll weave some more of them into the rest of my presentation this morning. But also just talking about, where you may get started with cover crops. One of the most important things starting out is to know what your goals are, because how you use cover crops is going to be completely driven by that goal. So we have both, short-term goals and long-term goals for cover crops. And I'm going to illustrate a few examples of where some goals that you might be thinking about for your cover crops. One may be to add nitrogen to your system, and this is a really fantastic and an important and historic way that we've thought about cover crops as a way of adding fixed nitrogen into the system. Another really important goal that many farmers have about cover crops is to build soil carbon and to increase soil structure. And here we've got, our slake test showing a soil that has more resiliency to resist water erosion. And those may be important goals, really long-term goals. We may have short-term goals of reducing water erosion if you're especially in hilly topography, or wind erosion, which I think is one of our concerns here on the prairies, especially in the early springtime. And as we have more low residue crops in our rotation, thinking specifically about some of our important legumes like soybeans or peas, we need to be thinking about how we create cover either before or after those crops in order to address this need. So I'll have some research results that talk about this window specifically later on. Another goal that you may have is to manage problem soils. And last year was a dry year. Last year also became a very wet year in the fall. And so we are constantly trying to manage for these 2 extremes. And you may have a goal of using cover crops in very targeted areas on wet soils to bring them back into production. Water, of course, moves with salt, and so cover crops can also have a fit for managing or trying to reduce the spread of salinity. You know, if you're not ready to put something into the perennial cover that you need to manage and prevent these really saline areas from developing, we can think about all kinds of creative strategies to utilize moisture and keep those salts lower in the profile. For example, this field here of corn, where the corn was planted but did not establish in this wet area around the slough. So once we know that that's happened, what are we going to do about it to make sure that we're transpiring water? Well, we can fill this area in with cover crops. So that allows us to monitor that area for a few years to decide where we might need to establish perennial habitat or vegetation to really take a long-term approach to managing salinity. Reducing tillage, cover crops is another way that we can try and reduce tillage. This is going to be especially important for organic systems. Alleviating soil compaction is a pretty interesting tool that has been documented that cover crops can help do. And if you want to know more about this, I don't have time to talk about it today, but ask me a question about how cover crops can do that in the question period. This is not, okay. Of course, grazing, as I mentioned, is one of the easiest ways to get started with cover crops. If you have livestock in your system or can collaborate with someone who can bring livestock into your grain system, this is really a no-brainer way to get started with cover crops. That may be your goal. But we also have other kinds of livestock. We have, pollinators and beneficial insects, and you can think about, if that's an important part of your goal, where are we going to put those cover crops in your farm so that these insects can access these important resources that they need to be around for managing all kinds of issues. So once you have your goal, we have a few more things to think about as you get started with cover crops. Once you know what your goal, think about, where is that window in my rotation where I can start meeting these goals? We talk about having such short growing seasons, and we do. But no matter where you farm, you are growing your grain crops to fill that window that you have. And so your struggle is not unique. Maybe our weather is more extreme than other parts where we're growing cover crops. But finding that best window is probably the most important place for having success when you start. So where are some of these windows that farmers in the survey were planting cover crops? Well, these are the number of farms that reported what they planted, or what was in rotation before they planted their cover crop. And so one theme that I see here is that there are a lot of cereals and early harvested cereals, I guess it depends for your area whether you consider it early season, but after wheat or after oats or after barley in rotation. But I was surprised by the diversity of crops. There is not just one crop type where cover crops are fitting into the rotation. So that's what farmers that are using cover crops right now are doing. So certainly some of the best windows for getting started are these early harvested crops that you may have in your rotation. And again, winter cereals bring a great opportunity to have a longer window for establishing and growing cover crops in our prairie environment. We also have, if you grow silage crops or other short season crops like vegetables where we have sort of dramatic biomass removal, these are excellent places to be starting thinking about cover crops in your rotation. Certainly grazing, where you can dedicate land because you know you're going to be getting that value from that annual forage, is also one of our best windows for getting started. I'm not hitting the right spot here. Now, thinking more spatially, you might not want to dedicate an entire field to cover crops, but maybe there are certain areas of your field where you're not able to grow a successful crop, and really you could be filling that space with some plants that are going to be working for you to address those problem soils that you may have. So wet areas of the field or saline areas of the field are places where I really want to encourage farmers to start thinking about getting cover crops into their system. Now, another type of fallow that exists that we should be thinking about is row crops. Because we have a lot of space in between those wide row crops where we can be using plants. And the trick is to find something that's going to be happy hanging out under that canopy until either the soybeans or the corn starts dying back, and those resources for those understory plants can be utilized. And so that's where these themes of intercropping and cover cropping become intermixed. So I'm looking forward to all that Lana and Scott are learning and are going to be sharing with you later on to think about this. And I'm going to, if I have time, I'll talk about a new project I have looking at intercropping cover crops with corn for grazing. So once we find that best window, we really need to start thinking about how we're going to manage and having a plan to manage those cover crops. Because it becomes a dance in terms of labor to establish these cover crops, either while you're establishing your grain crops or after your grain crops are harvested. And so having a plan means that you're more likely to succeed in getting the plan implemented when you're having a busy time. So in terms of the cover crop survey respondents this year, I asked them how they were seeding their cover crops, whether they were planting them with some kind of seeder or air seeder or drill, or whether they were broadcasting. And I was surprised to see that 3/4 of the farmers were using a drill. In terms of, were they establishing cover crops with their cash crops? That was also an interesting question. So we can see that 33 of the 80 respondents were seeding their cover crops with their cash crops, and only 13 of the 18 were broadcasting into their cash crops. So that means a large number of the farmers were also not intercropping their cover crops. They were either seeded after the cash crop was harvested, or they were seeding in areas where the cash crop was not growing in their fields. So that's some really interesting results in terms of how farmers right now on the prairies are seeding cover crops. Another question is, what are we seeding and what are we going to plant? So selecting what you plant is really important, and that has to be tied to what your goals are. So finding the plants that are going to help meet your goals, and that could be a whole talk in and of itself today. Coming back to the survey, it was very interesting to see the results of what farmers are growing right now. So I've grouped the different plants that were included in the survey responses into broadleaf plants, grasses, and legumes. So we can see these 3 families of plants are all represented in the types of cover crops that farmers are growing right now on the prairies. And we can see that right at the top here of the broadleaves, we have radishes, Phacelia, buckwheat, and sunflowers that are really being used a lot, as well as some important grasses like oats and fall rye and sorghum. And then some really key legumes here, clovers, peas, hairy vetch, sweet clover, and the list goes on there. So that maybe gives you some ideas of what types of cover crops to go to first. Lots of reasons to consider not just growing one cover crop species, but to grow a mixture of species, and the different types of plants that you can combine. So looking to combine different plant types, either different plant types in a mixture to complement one another within your cover crop mix, or to take a look at your rotation and see what kind of plant types am I not including in my rotation. Maybe I don't have many legumes in my rotation, and I want to bring that diversity with my cover crop. The type of mixture that you're going to pick is really driven by what window you're going to be aiming for, whether it's, early in the summer because, your field is wet and you couldn't get into that area for planting. So there you're going to be looking at more warm season species. If you're targeting the late fall, of course, you've got to adapt to things that are going to do well under cool conditions or over winter. So in terms of the diversity of cover crops that we see from the farmers that responded to the survey, we see here that the majority of the farmers that responded are growing a couple species together. And I think that's a great place to start in terms of balancing that desire for diversity, the practicalities of getting all those different seed sizes together and through your drill, as well as just managing the cost of this cover crop. I don't have time to talk about a whole bunch of reasons for growing different types of cover crop species, but if you're a person who's looking for, where do I get started in picking out cover crop species, these are my go-to resources that I use or that I direct my students to when we talk about picking cover crop mixtures in my classes. How am I doing here? Okay, so the last point that I have is getting started with cover crops. You need to adapt. You need to adapt to each field, to each scenario, and to each growing season. And that's the challenge, right? Most people want me to give them the recipe book on how can I have a successful cover crop. And the answer that I give is there is no recipe, but you need to think about cover crops as being more like a deck of cards. You have this hand, you are, dealt some cards, and you've got to respond to those conditions and to your knowledge of your fields and your farm in order to build the best recipe. So how do you get started? Well, finding those resources, finding a network of people to talk to about where they're starting is probably my best advice, is getting connected to that network. And that network could be, face-to-face in the coffee shop. It could be through social media or through Twitter. It could be through the conversations you have with the people today here in this hall. So the other piece of advice that I really want to emphasize, and I think is really important for us right now as we're innovating and designing and coming up with new ideas for cover crops on the prairies, is to have a plan to measure whether we've had a successful cover crop or not, or whether it was beneficial for our system. And there are a whole range of tools that you consider using in terms of, are you just interested in improving soil structure? And so, a simple shovel test, a visual assessment of the roots and how your soil is in terms of its color and structure are useful. Maybe soil cover is your goal. And so just measuring how much cover you are able to grow with your cover crop is a good way of assessing whether you've had success. Maybe long-term yields are the bottom line for you, and being prepared and ready to monitor those over time is going to help you know whether the money you put into cover crops, money and time, are paying off for you in your system. How am I doing for time? How much time do I have?
20 minutes.
I have 20 minutes. Hooray! Okay, so we have some time to talk now about, the new ideas I have and the new ideas that I'm looking at the university for cover crops. And I mentioned that I'm very interested in intensifying these fallow periods that we have. And so one of the fallow periods that I talked about was sort of what's happening in between the rows of our wider row crops. I'm collaborating on a project with Dr. Emma McGew in animal science, where we're looking at how can we engineer a balanced diet for winter feeding of cows through intercropping corn with higher protein forage. As an agronomist, I'm also interested in how these intercrops are influencing corn yield. And we were fortunate enough to get a one-year grant from the Beef Cattle Research Council to start looking at this system. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to continue this work with a new grant that we've applied for. But it was very exciting this summer, as challenging as it was, to play around with this corn system with the goal of increasing protein in cattle diets for winter grazing with corn. So what did we do in this experiment? Well, we worked at two sites. So we had a site in Carbon, and we had a site on a heavy clay soil just south of Winnipeg at the Kelburn Research Farm. And we looked at 6 different species intercropped with corn. So we had Italian ryegrass, a grazing radish, hairy vetch, red clover, and then a mixture of all those 4 species. And we compared that to no intercrop in between the corn rows. One question I had is, how are you going to fertilize a system like this, where we have, corn is such a high nitrogen demanding crop. If we grow it with cover crops, what is our goal going to be for fertilizing that crop? So we looked at 2 different levels of fertility, 40 pounds and 100 pounds. And we applied this mid-season with a simulated Y drop in order to get the nitrogen applied near the corn rows and not at the intercrop that I'd planted in the middle of the crop. So we had, kind of a higher target plant population. Maybe looking back, and we'll talk about it in a minute, whether maybe that was a bad idea, and I may want to dial that back for next year's experiment. And we established the intercrop with some good old elbow grease with a 1-row seeder. So looking at interseeding the cover crop in between the rows once we had our 2 herbicide applications to control the weeds within corn. And I think there are reasons to take a look at timing of establishing this intercrop, and I'll talk about those as we get into the data. So 2019 wasn't the best year to establish intercrops in corn. It was really dry, especially at the 2 sites we were working at. And so one of the things that I was most interested in was, was anything going to establish and was anything going to survive to the end of the season? So for me, success was that we had plant establishment of all these different cover crop types under our cover crop canopy. Now, the other measure that we were interested in, especially thinking about, could we supplement higher protein forage to cattle grazing corn in the wintertime, was how much biomass. And I think that is where we definitely reached a limitation with our growing environment, it being so dry, but also with the configuration and the balance of competition between the corn and the understory crop. So we had very low biomass. This is a picture of me in late September with our mixed treatment here, where we at Carmen, where we had our very best biomass growth. So nothing to write home about in terms of the biomass that we were able to grow, but I think a lot of success and promise that this system is going to have some legs if we can just figure out that balance of competition between these different plants. Emma is now taking these samples that we collected and analyzing them for their feed value. And, we know that we have limited amounts of biomass, but we'll have an idea of the potential that we may have for supplementing high protein forage with this, starch-rich, energy-rich corn feed. Another interesting thing to think about was, was there a negative impact on the corn of growing with the intercrop? And I would say in this growing environment that we have, we didn't see any difference in corn biomass between any of our intercropping treatments with our control. However, we also didn't see any corn response to the nitrogen, which makes me think that, we were really just dealing with a moisture deficit. But in this case, our cover crops didn't exacerbate the moisture deficit because their biomass was rather constrained. What else do I need to say here? Yeah, so we didn't have an effect on the corn biomass, but we did have an effect on corn yield. So me being an agronomy person, I'm always interested in, how these different intercropping treatments affect yield. Now, for the Carmen area, these are not exciting corn yields. But we didn't have a complete train wreck either. So I was pretty happy, again, with our initial experiment here. And one thing that completely fascinated me about this yield data is the response that we saw to intercropping with legumes. So again, 100 bushels of corn in the Carmen area is not very exciting, but we see a 5 to 15 bushel yield response in these really droughty conditions to intercropping with tiny amounts of biomass. Now, don't take this data home and say, I'm going to increase my corn yields by 5 to 15 bushels if I intercrop. That's not what I want you to take home today. But what I do want you to take home is some curiosity about what could be happening with these tiny little plants, with these big corn plants. Something is going on through the root systems of these legumes and this really big productive grass crop. And so I want to put a big cautionary note on this exciting data that we should be thinking about how these relationships can benefit our production systems, even under really extreme conditions like I saw in 2019 at Carmen, where it was so dry. There's something going on here, and I'm so curious to keep on studying this system to see if this only happens when it's really dry, and to try and understand what those relationships are in our environment. Okay, so stay tuned for what's happening with corn grain yields and intercropping. So from this first year, I feel like we had some success with establishing plants in between the corn rows, and I felt that we had reasonable, the waiting to seed after we were able to control weeds with herbicides worked well, and I would continue exploring that. But I think that there's a lot of interest in trying to reduce the number of passes over the field, and so I'm really curious about strategies for planting those intercrops at the same time as you establish corn. My intercrop survived, but I wouldn't say that it thrived. And another thing that I'm interested in exploring with this is how do you orchestrate this balance of competition? Is it through the corn plant population? Is it through corn row spacing? There's been a lot of interest looking further south to our neighbors this year about wide row corn, and I'm very interested in trying out some wide row corn in 2020. Or do we need to work with different species or fertility to try and balance that diet that we're looking for if our goal is to establish a higher protein forage when we're grazing corn? So, okay, and I talked about my interest in looking at what's going on below ground, especially with mycorrhizae. So lots of interesting things coming out of this experiment. One other experiment that I wanted to talk with you about today, especially if you are someone who's already working with cover crops, you're probably working with rye, and to some of you this may be a terrifying picture, but I am a professor, right? And if I'm not working on things that are slightly crazy, I'm probably not in the right spot with my research. So here is a picture of a rye cover crop with a farmer planting directly into this, jungle of rye, and this is a practice that's being called green seeding. There are several farmers in different parts of the world and in different parts of the U.S. that are doing this. But green seeding is all about trying to minimize that fallow period, and there's no better way to minimize that fallow period than to have overlap. And so this is a high-risk scenario, so this is something that's important to be doing research on. And so one of the things I've been doing in a quiet way for a few years, and now this year through funding, I was able to put a graduate student on a project where we looked at 5 different termination dates for rye. So everything from very conservative and terminating rye 2 weeks before planting to probably, from those that are already green seeding, but the best case scenario is terminating rye just around or just after planting, to the absolute worst case scenario and the scary picture where we would terminate the rye well after planting our grain crops. So having some idea on, what are the risks and the consequences if we attempt green seeding and things don't work out. The other thing that I was really interested in, maybe some of you know that I've been working with strip tillage for residue management. I was very interested in taking the strip tillage tool to cover crop like fall rye and seeing if targeted tillage might change the balance of competition between this rye and the crops that we were trying to and the grain crops we were trying to establish in the experiment. So we did this experiment with 2 different test crops, soybean being one of them and edible beans being the other. And the reason that I'm interested in these 2 crops as my test crops, of all the places to start, is that these are 2 crops that have very little residue after harvest. And so one of the ideas I want to look at is, can we preemptively grow this residue, this cover that we need, to prevent erosion after harvest. So we planted these 2 crops on the late side on May 30th. And we did this experiment again at Carmen, where we have sort of a loamy soil, and then at Calburn, where we have clay soil. And one reason why I'm really interested in working on clay soils is the idea that we can use this fall rye growing in the springtime to dry out the soil through transpiration. So the benefit of the clay soil is that it has moisture, and then the risk of the clay soil at seeding time is that it's too wet to plant. And one of the ideas that I'm really interested in exploring is, whether having that cover in the spring is a game changer for trafficability of fields. So what do these things all look like? Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so this is the day after planting in my experiment for the rye treatments where we direct seeded, so no strip tillage, and then the strip till treatment over here. And this is a picture when we had terminated the rye the day after seeding. So you can see how much rye residue we have here covering the rows. This was at the Calburn farm where we had lower rye plant stands. We also had treatments where we let the rye grow. So this is a picture of the treatments where the rye was terminated late. Both where we direct seeded it, and you can barely see the soybean plants because the rye had headed out. And we had challenges terminating the rye, especially in the edible beans, and we can talk about that. And then what it looked like in the strip till. How are we doing? 2 minutes? Okay. So we had Virginia Jansen, the graduate student working with me, who was busy collecting a lot of measurements. I can show you the results from the rye biomass as expected. The later we let that rye grow, the more it grew, and it was growing sort of exponentially as we left it grow and the season conditions improved. In terms of plant stand, this is a really interesting result. So there was no difference in plant stand establishment in 2019 at Carmen, whether we direct seeded or whether we used strip till. And for soybeans, we didn't see a statistical difference even when we let the rye grow for 2 weeks after planting. The edible beans were more sensitive in terms of plant stand establishment. And this is an interesting result. This is one of the reasons why I included this 4 days after termination treatment, because some of the more experienced green seeders have been saying that if you terminate your rye just after planting, that can actually be one of the worst times in terms of having some residue that's in the middle of dying and maybe not cooperating with your seeding equipment, and can be tough to cut through in terms of stand establishment. So we saw that for the edible beans, but we didn't see it for the soybeans. And we definitely saw a delay in development when we let that rye grow late. And so with edible beans, we'll see in the next slide that these consequences translated into yield. So here are the edible bean yields for 2019. This is averaged over our 2 locations at Carmen and Calburn. We saw, for all of the ideal timing, so either terminating 2 weeks before planting, 4 days before planting, or 1 day after planting, we didn't have any statistical differences in yield. But as expected, we really saw a decrease in yield. Our strip till treatment helped a little bit when we had that late planting, but I still don't think that that's enough. In terms of the soybeans, there we saw, as long as we terminated in the ideal range until just after planting, we really had no impact on yield. And they were still affected, but less sensitive than edible beans on termination timing. So a really interesting experiment, one that will continue in 2019 or in 2020. And so stay tuned. I think we're going to have a very different year where 2019 was very dry. 2020 is set up to at least have a very wet start to the growing season. One plea that I do have is, just like many of you, we had trouble with fall field work, and I am looking for some rye to be able to have this experiment, especially on a heavy clay soil, for 2020. And if you have rye and would be willing to host a 1 acre experiment, we would be happy to talk, or I would be very happy to talk with you. So we have some other things going on in the lab in terms of looking at cover crop planting dates. I have a rotation study started that's at 4 locations, and Lana is here and she's hosting one of them over in Redverse. We have a whole group of graduate students across the prairies that are going to be starting working on these experiments next year. And so there's going to be a lot of interesting things coming from this rotation study. These plot studies are paired with on-farm rotation studies, and we have 4 of them in the Red River Valley and 1 in Western Manitoba. And I am looking for other cooperators in Western Manitoba that might be interested in collaborating with me. And because I've run out of time, we'll just skip over here. So if you are someone who is growing cover crops and hasn't participated in the cover crop survey, I need you to add your voice to the information that we're collecting. Please reach out to me on Twitter or by email. And I just want to take a minute to thank all of the people that make all of this research possible, because this is something that takes a whole team of people to do, and I get the great pleasure of sharing all of these results with you. It also takes collaboration with funders, and it's been very exciting to have the support of a wide range of funders, from the commodity organizations to the Beef Cattle Research Council, as well as both the federal and provincial governments. So thank you for coming this morning, and I hope that the rest of the session will build on this theme of tools towards more regenerative systems. Thank you.
So is there any question for Yvonne, Lawley? Just maybe one question, yes.
I was wondering, on the termination of your rye, did you ever try a crop pruning system or a crop pruning?
So the question was about whether I've looked at roller crimping, so to terminate the rye, in combination with herbicides. Either or. So I have done some work, some preliminary work, probably 5 years ago already now, where I did look at the roller crimper, and I did not compare it with and without herbicides. I think that might be important if you are not organic. I think that's a really great idea. So looking at the interaction between roller crimping, and especially with the edible beans, I think that could really help a lot to get that flat architecture and to get that competition down. The one constraint that I have seen in my preliminary work with the roller crimper is to grow enough biomass to make that roller crimper work well and to not have the rye stand back up. We need to grow, I would say, around 3,000 to 4,000 kilograms per hectare of rye. And so in systems where we have less nitrogen available, especially in that early spring period, we may have a limitation with the roller crimper, but I think that's something that we can overcome if we figure it out in our systems. Other questions? I'm going to be here all morning, so if you want to come find me, I'll be happy to talk with you about your questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Please accept this small gift.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Please give the round of applause for Dr. Yvonne Lawley.